Okay, yeah, we're very pleased to have Danny Blanchflower, the Bruce B. Rauner Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College. He's also a part-time professor at the University of Stirling, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economics Research, a contributing editor for Bloomberg TV. And for the first time since moving to Burlington, we are pleased to have Carol Brown joining us.
Hello. Right. Thank you all. Good. And hello, Carol. Can I see if I can share my screen now? Let me just make sure I can do this. Share that. Can you see that? And then I'm going to try and go to slideshow and make sure you can see that. Can you see that? Can you see a picture of fishes and me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So I've talked. I was trying to remember how many times I've talked to you, and the answer is quite a lot. And I've tried to think about the well-being of the country. My well-being is impacted, of course, by Carol, but also by fish, and I like to fish down here. So this is a giant jack that I occasionally can catch. But I want to put this in context because I want to talk about well-being and the labour market, and I want to talk a bit about that. This situation we're now in terms of the pandemic, has a really big impact on two of the things that I've worked on for a really long time. And that is actually what is happening in the labour market. I'm a labour economist. I'm Dartmouth's basically only labour economist. And obviously I've talked to you about that. I've been working on this forever and ever. I started out in the early 80s writing a master's thesis about the young. But actually, this is not so much about the young. This is really about the prime age. So I want to talk a bit about what happened prior to the pandemic coming, and then the challenge the pandemic has had for us to actually understand what's going on. And I'm going to show you a few things that are shocking in a way. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? Because it's not in any way simple and not in any way what you'd see in a textbook. But what I really like is actually that, oops, I'm sorry, I messed with it. Can you see that? So there are two labour economists who I've known for 40 years, and they're both great. And one of them is Janet Yellen. And this is what she said from her acceptance speech. She says that basically she's a labour economist and that she cares about the toll unemployment has on people, families, and communities. And that's literally the first thing she said in her acceptance speech, understanding that what you need to do is to actually understand what's happening in the labour market. And I first met Janet Yellen, I think in 1993, and she was a governor of the Fed at the time, and she called me down to talk to her at the Fed about the analysis that I've been doing about the labour market and why we were differing in certain views. Okay, second thing. So the first thing is she was confirmed yesterday, sworn in. The second thing is that the other main economist now is actually another friend of mine, C.C. Rouse. And she's also a labour economist. And if you see, she says, I was drawn to the study of the labour market, the reasons that jobs disappear, the impact of education on people's job prospects. So the first thing to say is, obviously, I'm starting you out by saying there's all these issues in the labour market, but it turns out the reason you need labour economists is because it's not really simple to work out what's going on. And I'm going to put this in some context first and show you a couple of things. So I think I've talked to you about this before.
I think
everyone's okay. If there's a problem, shout out and I'll obviously take questions. So the first thing I want to set us up is that prior to the start of the pandemic, up to about 2019.
You can just join me.
Sorry, Rod, I can hear you. Sorry. Mute yourself, Rod. So the first thing I want to show you is that we have a major issue in the United States prior to the onset of recession, basically to do with the prime age, especially the prime age less educated. And I'm going to talk to you about quite a lot about that. There's a great book that people might like to look at called by my friends Anne Case and Angus Deaton. It's called Deaths of Despair. And it talks about the fact that the mortality rates of the prime age, less educated whites. So this story, in many sense, I'm going to give to you, is a story about prime age whites. This chart is something from a new paper I'm happy to send to people. I just had out in the American Journal of Public Health. And this asks people about the last 30 days. And it asks a simple question. How many of the last 30 days were bad mental health days? I mean, I'm not going to ask everybody, but if you ask that question, you can do from 0 to 30. If you ask that question, just so you know, 2/3 of the people say 0, none of them. And about 3/4 of the sample say 0, 1, or 2. But the question is, well, what about people who say 30? What about people who say 30? And the answer is, let's think of those as people of being in despair. So this blue line, it's actually for other people it's quite high, but this blue line is the proportion of people who are white, who don't have college education, how they feel on a daily basis. And what we know by 2019, and we're tracking it now, and it looks to have got a lot worse, 1 in 8 of those people say every day of their lives was a bad mental health day. So that sort of sets up vulnerabilities. We know from deaths of despair that this morbidity translates into mortality. It turns out deaths of despair from suicide and from alcohol poisonings and from opioids disproportionately fall amongst this group. I'm going to show you another chart just come out which we didn't know. So we've been looking at stuff about opioids, and we knew that story about opioids, but we now got some new evidence, which actually this is the new chart for the US. This is actually deaths from cocaine. And I always thought that deaths from cocaine were particularly amongst younger groups. But actually what you see here, look at the black line. The black line is 35 to 44-year-olds. And in 2009, they were kind of in the middle of the pack. But actually, as time has gone on, we see suddenly that both the 35 to 44-year-olds and the 45 to 54-year-olds are disproportionately in this position. So they were in despair at the start. So what has happened so this is how you start out before the pandemic starts. And I want to show you this chart. It's from the UK, but it's a pretty interesting and scary chart. It's a bit heavy duty, but let me explain what this is. So I've written a lot of stuff about happiness. We could go into, can you measure it? But I've got oodles and oodles of paper. Yes, the answer is you can. So essentially what happens is that this question is asked, and we've never seen anything like this. This is why I'm showing it to you. So, and if I look back at the 2008 recession in America and in the UK and around the world, that recession didn't really reduce people's happiness. But let me show you this. So this is a survey done in England. The data's better there, but it's pretty consistent with here. So this question has been asked. It's about how happy are you? How satisfied with your life are you? And this question has been asked in the major surveys done to calculate the unemployment rate. And if you look at that box in the middle, it shows you that from 2016 to 2020, scored from 1 to 10, the mean score was about 7.7, unchanged. In a 1-week period, from the beginning of March to the end of it, when the country went into lockdown, that series dropped from 7.7 to 5.4. Say it again. It dropped from 7.7 to 5.4. We have never seen in any data ever anything like that. And so this is an issue that we need to grapple with. This has had a huge shock on people's well-being. But there is something that we also need to talk about, which is that, well, maybe it's not quite as bad as you think, because actually what happened from around March to about September was that people learned to adapt. So as they see other people in this situation, the happiness thing starts to rise. But now when you go into lockdown, which happens, and essentially there's a new strain of virus in the UK, this series drops. So even today, the series is now at about 5.8. So the first thing is that this series for the whole sample is really, I mean, a series we have never seen before, and data from around the world is consistent with that. So we really no idea what's going on and what the consequences are of this enormous drop in well-being. We're in territory we've never really been in before. And that's what I'm going to show you. If you want, anyone wants to ask about this, I'm happy to send the chart, but it tells you about how lockdown comes. But the first thing I would say is that the big news, in a sense, is that this is a shock, but people appear to have adapted to it and learned from it. But there's basic vulnerabilities, and I'm going to suggest that Rotary, in a sense, needs to focus particularly on those who were vulnerable at the beginning, because this is the averages, and for subgroups, this is a big issue. So I'm going to move on from that. But if anyone would like to ask about that, that's the well-being stuff, and we've got obviously lots of data now about people, how anxious they are and how depressed they are, and whether they can find food or not. And these are the kinds of data that Janet and Cece and so on are looking at as part of the argument that we need to do a pandemic thing. Is we need to worry about the mental well-being of the population, and I'm going to show you what the issues are. And it's not actually simple what to do. I mean, I've been talking to Cece and Janet already quite a lot because we don't exactly know what to do. And I'm going to show you some of the problems. So if I can go on, how much time have I got? I'm going to go on for about 15, 20 minutes. Is that all right?
That's good.
Yeah, okay. And obviously we can go back. But let me just try and explain to you. So the first thing is that the data on well-being doesn't look great. Okay, but that it's unprecedented. But let me show you some other things that are pretty hard to understand. So this is the great puzzle. I mean, for Janet Yellen and the CC and Biden, in a sense, these are the huge puzzles, because it turns out that our statistical procedures are not well set to actually answer what's gone on. So can I show you the two numbers on the left and the right? So the number on the left, so remember, so March to April, we get this huge increase, the lockdowns, and the spread of the virus. So in the raw data, the unemployment rate goes from 4.6 to 14.5. And then you say, oh, it's diminished since then. But it turns out that our procedures that are in place to measure what's gone on, I mean, it's not a US thing, it's not been caused by the Trump administration or anything, it's true around the world. They're simply not in a good place to tell us what's going on, and I'm going to show you this, and then show you the puzzle we have of what the heck to do. So if you look on the right, it turns out that all the surveys that we take, the non-response rates go through the roof. So if you think 85% of the people were asked to come to the survey previously, well, it drops to 55% between March and April. First of all, people don't respond to the surveys. And the second thing is interviewers who are locked in their homes would go to people's houses are not there. But let me show you the number on the right. The number on the right is actually the real number. The real unemployment rate is the number on the right. And here's the problem. The problem is that people are asked the question. They're asked, and this is people who are in furlough. They're asked, the survey interviewers are asked to classify people who is, quote, absent from work due to temporary coronavirus-related business closures or cutbacks. And they're asked, the interviewer is told to tell those people that they're unemployed. But they don't do that. The people themselves actually classify themselves as employed. So the problem that BLS faces, and I'm trying to explain this through to you, the problem is that in the past, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS has never corrected people. So you just report what people say. So it turns out that actually if people did it right, and this phenomenon I wrote about at the bottom, this phenomenon at the bottom had never occurred before, but it applies to employment, the unemployment rate of blacks, everything in the labor market is subject to this bias, and we don't quite know how to adapt to it. So let people understand that that this phenomenon in April 2020, the unemployment rate was declared at 14.5%. But if you're like me and you read the data release and you go to the box and it says actually that's wrong, It's really 19.7%. Okay, so this turns out around the world to be a major issue. What do you do about people who are furloughed or temporary out of work? What about people who earn zero? Turns out we don't exactly know. And I talked a little bit at the beginning about, well, what about when there's, if and when there's long run changes in behavior? What's going to happen? And of course, the big question is, are these people really employed? I mean, they're on a furlough from some company in Hanover, but maybe the company knows that they're not going to rehire them. So the issue is, A, are they really employed? And the answer is, well, they think they are, but they're really not. And what we'll also see is there's a huge disconnect between what firms say about how many workers they've got and what people say. The firm says this person doesn't work here anymore, but the person says, I'm employed, I'm going to be called back by this firm, and looks in the data that they're probably not. So this is something we've never seen before. And in the latest data still, that issue has not been resolved, and it's about 0.6. The gap is about 0.6. Yesterday in the UK, we've had exactly the same thing, exactly the same sets of issues, and the unemployment rate, it appears, it essentially underestimates by about a half what the unemployment rate is. And this is a really big problem to work out what's going on. But I want to show you a couple of things which I've talked a little bit to you about before, but I want to show you some issues that we need to grapple with, where if you just run to the statistics, you're going to get this thing wrong. So let me show you this story in America, which I think is a sad story and basically has a great deal to do with the rise of despair. There's a great deal to do with the deaths of despair. It's this series here. And for now, ignore the right-hand side. This seems to be, I mean, in a sense, this is Janet Yellen and CC Rouse's issue, which is, what are you going to do about the real wage of the people in the middle? How are you going to raise wages for people, and particularly the people at the low end? So if you wouldn't mind, just ignore for now that thing on the right-hand side, this huge increase on the right-hand side, which of course I'm going to show you is, the data's ridiculous and makes no sense. But this tells us about the American dream. People have written, this chart suggests the American dream is over, and we can talk about it. But let me show you this. You may disagree with that, probably will, but some people have argued that it's this chart that's the worry. So this is what we call real wages. So this is just wages adjusted for prices. So if wages rise by 2% and prices rise by 2%, real wages haven't risen at all. So you can set things in constant, it's in constant 2008 dollars, and then you can calculate what the real wage is adjusting for prices. So this shows you that between 1964 and 1972 or so, real wages rose quite substantially by, from about 290 to 340. Since then, from 1970 through to 1994, they dramatically fell. And by 2018, you could see they're 20% or so below what they were in 1970. So obviously there's an issue, which is, 45-year-old less educated high school graduates see their earnings less than their parents' earnings and their grandparents' earnings. So this turns out to be a major issue. But there is a weirdness, which you see here, and I just want people to grapple with why this is a big problem, because the data don't help you, and why you want a labor economist to disentangle it. Look at this thing on the right-hand side. So this thing on the right-hand side shows you that since March 2020, there has been the biggest rise in real incomes that we've ever seen. Doesn't make any sense, right? Makes no sense at all. Big rise in unemployment, we've seen the rise in unemployment. But in all the wage data that we have, and I'm going to show you, it suggests not only that real wages have risen dramatically, but nominal wages have risen dramatically. And that doesn't make any sense. So when you hear these things, you just have to understand, this makes no sense. So let me show you this. So I have a little column from December the 23rd in The Guardian, which I'm happy to send people, and you can just have a look at it because it sort of lays this out. We have something very strange that's gone on, and this is what we're having to grapple with. Can I show you this chart, and then I'll show you some real numbers? Oh, actually, let's go to the chart, and then I'll give you the numbers. So here is the unemployment rate, I mean, the unemployment rate has been rising. I'm sorry, that's for let's do the US. I'm sorry, let's do this. So here's the unemployment rate I showed you went from 3.9 to 17, 18, 19, and now it's at about 7. But what happened to wages? What happened to so the story is, so everyone's doing great because wages have risen. Well, that turns out not to be true. But let me show you this. So as soon as I remember, I gave you a minute ago, I told you that the unemployment rate, go back, the unemployment rate jumped, look, in March and April, it jumped from 4.6 to 15 to 13 but what happened to wages? Well, this is a big problem for us to understand. Look at that. So we get to March, we got wage growth, that's how much wages grow each year. The answer is from April, it jumped more than we have ever seen ever before, anywhere, ever. Makes no sense, right? So unemployment. So what you would think, imagine what you would think. You'd think in 2000, as the unemployment rate went up, you'd think wage growth would fall. That's the relationship you'd think ought to exist. So the P's at the bottom are the latest ones, and these data just get revised twice, and this is, but just for now we can ignore it. So currently, with an unemployment rate of 7%, we have wage growth of 7%. What? Exactly the same in the UK too. We have exactly the same phenomenon going on. And let me show you some very weird things. So look at this. So this is, we can do it by groups. We can do it by groups of workers. Okay, so look at 2020 Q1. That's the wage growth of people up to that point. It was in the 5s. We get to 2020 Q2, that's the second quarter of 2020, and you'll see an overall wage growth of this group of 10%, and by Q3 it's 8%. This is obviously a great puzzle. So let me suggest what's going on, and then we'll try and think about solutions, because how to fix this depends a great deal about people's long-run changes in behavior and what's going to happen to these people. So approximately what appears to have happened, I mean, we don't exactly know, but this will do. The rough way to think of it, I like cricket, but you can make the analogy in baseball, but I'll make the one in cricket just to make it easy, but it's the same. Unlike in baseball where there's 9 players, there's 11 players in cricket, right? And if I just say, well, what's the batting average of the 11 players? And you say, in cricket, it's like 30 runs. But if you drop out the poorest 2, the weakest 2, the average of the batsman, the average of the remaining 9 rises. So what we have here is, does everyone get it? All that happens is we've got a batting average effect. So imagine I take all of you guys, and I take the average out, and then I just take out whatever it is that I'm doing, a beauty scale or whatever it is, and I take out the 2 that score the worst. The overall score rises. So that's what we have. So now the issue is actually that the bottom part of the wage distribution has dropped out. So basically all the data that we have essentially out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is essentially worthless, because we've got to do something about the people who either are not, who've just disappeared out of this series, but often that report a wage of 0. And the concern is that those are exactly the same people who are in despair to start with, and they were a group of people who were disproportionately impacted by the virus. So anyway, I'm reporting to you essentially the huge puzzle that Janet and Cece are, they're working on this right now. I've been talking to them about exactly these slides. What is going on? What are you going to do? And how are you, I'll leave it with this, but see, and then we can talk about it. But the idea, of course, is how can you get wage growth down? How can you, just think of it as, the average is pulled down because the people who are the lowest paid have dropped out. So those people have dropped out of the labor market. They're not in jobs. And for recovery to be of any sense at all, those folks have to come back into the wage distribution. And the question is, will they? So I thought I would show you this puzzle and try and think about going forward. And obviously the question is, what do you do about it? And in all probability, you're going to have to try and find and make sure that the firms that employ these folks continue to do so, because otherwise we're going to see a very dramatic rise in the unemployment rate of these folks who are currently, they're not counted so much in the unemployment numbers, and we're going to see a big decline in their well-being. So in a sense, I've set you up as a big puzzle. Here's a fish that I caught this week, which is pretty nice. It's a snook. But anyway, so I'll stop there. But the idea is that, the idea I want to show you is that this is a world where happiness has collapsed. We've never seen anything like that. And we have never before seen anything like I'm just showing you. So we don't exactly know what's going on and actions needed. So that's to set you up and let people talk. And but this, I mean, you can see this is probably as big a puzzle in economics as I have ever seen. I've never seen anything. I've never seen anything of the orders of magnitude of the drops in the change in the unemployment rate. I've never seen ever. We have no history ever. Sorry, I have never seen any history where the unemployment rate went up by 10 percentage points in a month. I've never seen anything like that. And I have never seen a wage growth like this. And I've never seen a collapse in well-being series like this. So the question is, what scarring does it do? What are the long-run consequences of it? And what happens if people's long-run behavior changes? So questions, that should hopefully get people.
Well, it makes me want to go trash the Capitol or something. No, it doesn't.
I mean, in some sense, we have to try and understand why people are discontented. I mean, if you talk to Angus Deaton and me, who've written lots about this, if you asked us what's going on, we both argue it's the labour market. So it's the failure of the labour market, essentially, is our view. But anyway, please.
Well, I hadn't raised my hand, so I don't really have a question ready.
I'm sorry, David.
It's nice to chat. Come on, someone must try. I mean,
it's the restaurants and the bars, and it's
restaurants and the bars,
and the hotels and all those businesses that are closed.
Yeah, I mean, then the question is, are they going to reopen?
Right.
And if they don't, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
I mean, what are you going to do with these millions of people?
Heidi.
Heidi, please.
Yeah. So the restaurants and the bars are among the top losses, right, of jobs in the country, hospitality, restaurants, etc. But the interesting thing about that is that many of the employees, the bartenders, the waitresses, the hostesses, they get tips. Are those included in their real wages, Danny, or do those tips get hidden and not reported to the IRS?
They do make adjustments for them. They do make adjustments. I mean, as good as you can do, but they make adjustments for that in the wage that's reported for those workers. I mean, the other thing to say, Heidi, is that actually it's also true that the job losses disproportionately have impacted women. But well, that's the first thing, and then the second thing is actually quite interesting stuff. So I quite like reading. So Elsevier is one of the publishers of most academic journals, and they say that across all fields, the submission rates to academic journals from women are hugely down. So A, their job losses are greater, and B, the responsibility on women is greater, right? But I mean, in a sense, what I'm trying to get us to is that, you know, all this stuff may eventually work out. But why, in a sense, what the argument for having a package of measures to come in now is to ease the process of adjustment and allow firms eventually, right, to survive until this thing is over. The reason is that it's much easier to kill a firm off than it is to create a new one. So in a sense, what the labor economists are trying to think about is what you can do to encourage and allow for the adjustment process to come. But presumably many of these restaurants will not reopen. So the question is, what are you going to do? I mean, in Hanover, are these restaurants that closed, and, you know, what's going to happen? But of course, the consequences fall on these people. And if you look at things like, if you look at stuff like, how much difficulty have you had in paying your bills? 15% of people say I have serious difficulty in paying my bills last week. If you look at have you had difficulty finding food? The answer is yes. So anyway, but this is, in a way, I keep trying to say, this is beyond anything I have ever known. Hi, Bob. By the way, I haven't seen Doning saying Bob. So thank you, Heidi. Great question. Sorry.
David Allen.
And now I do have a question. Following discussions in Washington, I wonder if you could comment on a couple of things being debated. One is raising the national minimum wage to $15 an hour. Is that going to help or hurt? And two is a more open-ended question is Congress is talking about ways of supporting small businesses. What can Congress do that supports small businesses?
Yeah, can I take the first one? Well, the second one, in a sense, is I've sort of answered it in the sense that you have to recognize that killing off small businesses is pretty easy. You have to try and allow them to give them enough help to allow them through the adjustment period. Okay. But the thorny one is the first one. The thorny one is about the minimum wage. The thing to remember is if you were to look back 25 years ago and look at the level in nominal terms of the federal minimum, it hasn't changed since then. If you were to just go back and look at what in real terms, of my chart, and what in real terms would that federal minimum be, it would be about $24 an hour, right? So the first thing is that the minimum wage is very low compared to the past. Second, I always say to the students that the federal minimum wage doesn't bind north of the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, my kids worked at the Nugget, and the Nugget, I think they paid $10 an hour. And so people always say that north of the Mason-Dixon line, McDonald's pays it. So that's the second thing. The third is that actually the economists have done masses of stuff on this. And essentially they found that given the very low levels of the federal minimum, there is no evidence that has significant and negative employment effects. That's the evidence. Obviously the question is how far do you raise it and what would that do? But at its level, it hasn't had much of an effect. And I can tell you the most famous study was done in Carroll's old state of New Jersey, and people looked at, they did this nice experiment, which is so they looked at McDonald's and Burger King on the border between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and then New Jersey raised the minimum, and then they went and looked what happened. Well, here was the fundamental fact, which was interesting. The answer is it had no real effect on employment, but what it did was this. Prior to the raise in the New Jersey wage, the average duration of people's tenure at McDonald's was about 6 weeks, right? So you essentially train them for 2 days, that's the fixed cost of training, and they stay for 6 weeks. What they found was you raised the minimum and better people showed up and they stayed longer. So that amortized the cost of the training over a longer period. So the evidence is, given the very low levels of the federal minimum, then it doesn't appear to have large employment effects. The question is how high to raise it. I mean, in a place like Seattle, everyone said raise it to $15, going to have a big. The answer was they were probably paying. Starbucks was probably paying $14.92, right? So the obvious question is, particularly, is it going to have an impact in the South? And the other thing is that the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, reduces inequality. It just makes the people at the low end better off. The one thing actually, very often is that people on the minimum wage are hours constrained. So even if you're on the minimum and you're working you've got 2 jobs, but they actually would like to get 3 and they can't get enough hours. So I think the debate is sort of accepted. The evidence is in that there aren't large employment effects, and actually raising it would actually help poverty. So that's the argument, and the policies on the table now is to raise the federal minimum by 2025 to 15. I mean, presumably that raises the labor price in some places, and firms can adjust by hiring capital. But the evidence is that at these very low levels, it's probably not going to be a big deal. That's the basic conclusion that I know Cece and Janet think, because we all think like that. That's the evidence.
Did I see Bob Haynes has got his hands up and his mic is muted?
So Bob, yeah, and that's all.
There we go. Thanks, Dan. I agree with you. It's much easier to keep a business in place than to resurrect one. How would you feel about changing the tax rate, the income tax rate? I remember as a young person, long time ago now, the rates were much higher than they are now. And I remember the rates in the UK were something astronomical. But
right. Carol's my expert on taxes, but let me just respond. I mean, obviously, I'm a labor economist who believes in markets. Janet we believe in markets, right? And so if you raise taxes too high, that has disincentive effects on people, no doubt, right? So if you just keep raising taxes, that prevent, people choose not to work and so on. So the question is, what tax changes can you do? I certainly think that the overall burden of taxation right now should be probably lowered. Spending should be raised. So the economy needs to have a boost. I'm certainly not in the game of thinking about raising taxes. The view, I think, is that certainly at the low end, we've got to think about ways of encouraging people to work. And the work that I set up at the beginning, if I learned one thing from the work I've done on happiness, it's that people like to work. There is no evidence that they like to be unemployed. So I think that's a really big deal to give firms incentives to hire. But the other thing perhaps people can think about, that the way a labor economist thinks of things is that, so if you think about why do firms adopt capital, the answer is because the relative price of capital is lower than the relative price of labor, right? So you can encourage firms to hire labor by giving them incentives to hire people. They can lower the relative price of capital to labor. So that's one way to go. But I think you always have to be mindful that, I always teach this to the Dartmouth students. I always say that, and Bob will know this, if you put some policy in place and they don't like it, they're smart enough, they'll find some way around it. If you say, you've got to do this, they'll go, okay, now how can we get around that? Well, that's how the world works, right? And in tax policy, I have an example given to me about tax policy in California. It's a good one for Bob. Apparently the idea was that they were going to make marijuana legal, tax it, and that was going to be a major revenue source for the city, for the state. Turns out that now you've made it illegal, police can't arrest somebody for having marijuana, but the market price of marijuana is X, and then it's got a sales tax on top. So that's an incentive for the illegals to make and sell marijuana, because now nobody's policing it, and they can sell marijuana under the price that is being sold legally. So the estimates of what happened, the estimates of how much money they were going to get from the sale of marijuana were about 3 times too much, because the black market emerged that could split the tax price on the top. So the answer is, I think you have to be very careful. The great thing about Janet Yellen is Janet's unbelievably smart. And I love to tell the story. As I said, I've known her for 40 years. I love to tell the story that a husband who actually is famous, when you buy a car, there's a lemon law. Her husband, George Akerlof, won a Nobel Prize for the paper on lemons and all that. But in his Nobel Prize speech, he said one of the most famous phrases ever. He said, "I'm really grateful to win the Nobel Prize, but I have to tell you, I'm the second smartest economist in our household." I'm the same with the tax policy here. Carol had it right, I think, about you put tax. Taxes are, in a sense, you might raise a tax, and it's perfectly possible, like they did in California, it's perfectly possible you raise a tax and you reduce revenue.
Well, I'm just glad we agree on something.
There you go. But I think it's a great question, and I think we're going to have to. At the moment, the issue is, we're not in a position. Janet said, they said, what are you going to do about the $2 trillion from all the tax cuts? And she said, I'm going to leave that. This is not the time to do anything like that. We need to go focus on the labor market and give incentives to people. And I'm going to go back to your point, Bob, which is about ease the adjustment out of this thing, right? We don't know how long it's going to be. People talk about a K-shaped recovery. We don't know what the recovery is, but the K-shaped recovery is that the rich people do well and the poor people do badly. But if you've dropped out the bottom 20% of the wage distribution, we are in trouble because we've got to bring it back. So, right? So in a sense, Bob's point was that David's point was worrying about the minimum wage. But what we have here are people who are in work who are earning zero. Their hourly wage is zero, right? They're furloughed and their hourly wage is zero. Right. So that's some of the issues. Oh, I think Wayne had a question. Sorry, can I go to Wayne? Is that all right?
Yes, go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, my question is about infrastructure projects.
Correct.
It strikes me that that would be a way to employ people to get jobs done that need to get done, and you could set wages at a level that would be sustainable, so people could make a living.
Yes. So a couple of things. Infrastructure has considerable benefits. I always tell the students, you know the exit on I-89 when you come to Hanover, that exit to Montcalm. Do you know why it's there? It goes to nowhere. It was an exit to nowhere. It was an exit to a fence. Do you remember? You come off, it's an exit. Do you know why that was there? Well, when the infrastructure spend was there before, other state, I mean, if you have an exit, that's a lot of extra money. And so the New Hampshire senators apparently said, we need more money coming in, so we need more exits. So they built an exit to nowhere, right? I mean, but the truth is that infrastructure matters, but I do here's an idea that I like. So they talk, and people have been thinking about it. So I like this idea, which is they talked about 3 million jobs. Well, how about you do this? So what you might do, I'm just coming up with an idea. You decide that what we're going to do is we're going to insulate millions of houses, okay, across the center part of the country. That will lower their energy bills. Well, what you could do is you could actually take lots of these people who I'm caring about, and you train them as insulation engineers, and you pay them $40 an hour, and you say, go build the infrastructure. Well, that's not a bad idea, right? I mean, you can see the benefits of it, right? You pay them a decent amount of money. You take the people, you take Jamie Vance's people out of Appalachia. So infrastructure is a big deal. The benefit in Keynesian terms is it boosts the economy, but you could spend it in a way that has a major. I like the idea of that. The danger with an infrastructure project is that it's all capital and not enough people. But you could make it such a way, right? Building an extra exit doesn't really hire many people, right? I wouldn't be in favor of that. But the idea of insulating houses is a good one. But in macro terms, you want to boost the economy. You want to improve the way the infrastructure. I like things like give $100 billion to the National Science Foundation. Give $100 billion to the National Institute of Health. Tell them about build new viruses, build new vaccines. So stuff like that. Help our infrastructure through IT or whatever. So I think that's a big thing you're going to see. The difficulty is it takes a while, but there are things called shovel-ready projects, and usually you'll find they're actually really big. What they mean, and Hanover could be in a position for this, normally what a shovel-ready project means is that it's received planning permission, it's ready to go. So imagine Hanover has a bridge or a roundabout or something that it's just waiting to get funded. It turns out that those things can actually, a hospital has got to be built. It's agreed, but we can't find them. Well, we just find the money and away we go. That at least can speed the thing up. To actually argue, we're going to build a train line between here and Los Angeles ain't going to solve the pandemic problem. So I think your point, but you got to do stuff that's going to have an impact right now. And I like the idea of insulating houses. I mean, it's hard to see what the downside to it is. I like all these people being hired at $40 an hour, being trained. And then there's trainers and there's.
All right. I see John's hand is up, but then I think that will be the last one. All right.
Where's John?
Well, thanks.
Oh, there you are. Hi, John.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Nice to see you.
So in terms of training, what if I'm that white guy who doesn't have a college education, and I grew up and I always wanted to be a steel worker, or I always wanted to be a coal miner. And, people are now saying, well, those jobs don't exist anymore. and you need to be retrained. I don't want to be retrained. What
I mean, if you choose, in a sense, this is not a command economy, right? This is you're going to take the consequences of what you choose. The issue we've learned is that national programs for training don't work. You've got to try and make it very local, right? So what works in Cleveland doesn't work in Hanover, doesn't work in wherever. But I think, in a way, the job of the Department of Labor, in some sense, is to make it clear that the coal mining is not coming back. It's not. Talc mining is not coming back to St. Lawrence in New York. The steel plants aren't coming back. But in a sense, what we can say is, I answered Wayne by saying, well, we could come up with something. I can come up with, you could become how about instead of doing that, you become I want to get to it in a sec though, you become an insulation engineer. Can I go back? Because I've been working on exactly this. It turns out that people in the past, let's think of white high school people who worked in a union job in a steel plant, right? They worked, say, or in a coal mine. Here was what was true about what they did. They worked in a steel plant, but actually they hated the job. They hated the job, but they liked the money. And they wouldn't move because all the alternatives were worse. But I think what actually you said to me was not that they wanted to work in a steel plant. It wasn't that they wanted to work down a mine. They wanted to work in a job that paid the good wage that the steel plant paid. So I think that's the way to solve your problem. The evidence is that union workers had higher wages, they quit less, and they hated the job. It's funny, right? I want a job in a steel work, but my dad absolutely hated it, but he was rich because of it. And so you have this dilemma. And you say, well, you wanted to go down a mine, you got pneumoconiosis, and the thing fell in, the accidents were terrible. And the answer is that they got decent pay. So that, I started you out with, in a sense, that's what Janet and Cece have said. Their job is to try and work out what's going on in the labor market and try and make things better for those at the bottom. But the fact that I showed you, it's great, wages are rising, that's just not true, right? That's not true. So the problem is that most of the data we now have in the pandemic turns out to be, we don't have infrastructure and systems set up to measure this. So in a sense, their job, Madam Secretary and Cece, their first job is to literally, what the heck is going on? Yeah. But you don't disagree with me, right? It's about, you can say, look, I need to put a steel plant, but I can make you an insulation engineer at $40 an hour. He's going to go, woo, right?
The one thing I remember my father telling me in high school was that they don't call it work because it's fun.
Right. Well, my dad hated his job. My dad absolutely hated his job, and all he ever wanted to do was retire from it. And I always thought to myself, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have a job that I hate.
We're going down a rabbit hole.
Right? You got a 9 to 5, and you go home and you try and forget about it. But in a sense, it is that chart I showed you, which is what he said to you is, I miss the fact that I could have had real wages like that, and I want that. And we have to, and for the American dream to really take hold again after the pandemic, we have to restore that.
We're going to stop there, Danny. Thank you very much. That was great. As always, greatly appreciated. Greatly appreciated.
You were miserable when you came in and even more miserable when you left.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Sorry.
Very nice, Danny. Thank you very much.
Oh, hi, Dennis. I didn't see you.
So we're going to move on with the club business. You're welcome to stay, Danny. Carol, thank you. Good to see you all.
Thank you much.
Okay.
Thanks all. How do I leave? Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.